Once again, it's time for our monthly trip to 1968. This time, we're going to revisit some cool British singles released in August and September of that year. August 1968 was a rather slow and weak month for singles, so it didn't really deserve an entire video dedicated to it. September, on the other hand, was actually a very good month, so this video will feature singles from both August and September. Let's begin. The biggest British hit of September 1968 was Hey Jude by the Beatles. At the time, the song was understood as the Beatles' response to the so-called marathon songs that were popular during that period. A good example of these so-called marathon tunes, and also the most popular, was MacArthur Park by Richard Harris. These were lengthy songs clocking at 6 or 7 minutes, and they all featured a prominent piano and a huge orchestra. Hey Jude certainly fit that description, but the song was simpler and more straightforward in its structure. Record Mirror wrote,
"Very simple, the start of this somewhat incredible marathon. Paul sings with a sturdy sort of backing, but it suddenly erupts into violence of sound. Somebody in the office reckons it is the official send-up of marathon records, but then at the same time he agrees it is magnificently done. I found interest vanished up the creek for a short while midway, and then came a few surprises later on. But I should jolly well think it'll be a hit."
Hey Jude obviously became a huge classic, and still remains one of the Beatles' most popular songs. Personally speaking though, my favorite of the two sides is the B-side. John Lennon's guitar tone alone is worth the price of admission. Oddly enough, Revolution got mostly negative reviews in the press. Chris Welch from The Melody Maker praised the A-side but described Revolution as a fuzzy mess, best forgotten. The song was released just a few months after the May 1968 events in Paris, and its release coincided with the police brutality that took place during the anti-Vietnam protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The track was criticized by both British and American counterculture publications for its anti-revolutionary message. Time magazine devoted an entire article to discussing the song, and praised its message against radical activists. The approval from Time magazine, a mainstream publication widely viewed as reflecting establishment views, added to the song's lack of credibility among the counterculture. Political debates aside, the song showed that the Beatles had definitely moved away from the studio-based psychedelic experimentation that had dominated their work from 1967. And it proved that the return to organic and unpolished sounds that the Stones pioneered with Jumping Jack Flash in May 1968 was definitely here to stay. The single reached #1 in both Britain and in the States, and it became a massive international hit. September 1968 also saw the release of Jethro Tull's second single, which was also featured on the band's debut album. John Peel reviewed the single for The Melody Maker. Peel said,
"This is also on their LP, which is musically very good, but the production isn't very good, which is unfortunate. They produced it themselves, and it could have benefited from some more professional knowledge, because they are a very professional group. They have a good mixture of Roland Kirk and Captain Beefheart, which all goes back to the blues, obviously."
The B-side was a song dedicated to John G., manager of London's Marquee Club in the late 60s. Later in December 1968, Jethro Tull were featured on the Rolling Stones' Rock and Roll Circus, where they appeared miming to the A-side of the single. As a curious note, their appearance on the show featured future Black Sabbath member Tony Iommi on guitar, who was a member of Jethro Tull for a short period of time. The single failed to chart. One of the biggest hits from September 1968 was this Beatles cover by Joe Cocker. The recording featured drums by Procol Harum's B.J. Wilson, guitar lines from Jimmy Page, organ by Tommy Eyre, and prominent backing vocals. Joe Cocker's previous single had been a massive commercial failure, but Penny Valentine predicted that this single would become a huge hit. Penny Valentine wrote,
"I loved Margarine and will never understand why it wasn't a hit. After that silence from Mr. Cocker, whose voice is amazing, came nothing. And now this. This has been worth waiting for. It's a very long soul version of the Lennon and McCartney song and very, very good. I would like to think this is going to be a huge smash. And it must just be that, if it gets played and played.
The song became a huge smash indeed. The single reached #1 in Britain and became a huge hit all over Europe. In the States, the single reached number 68 according to Billboard. Another highlight from September 1968 was this single by Traffic. The song, which was written by Dave Mason and produced by Jimmy Miller, was also featured on the group's second album. Disc Magazine's journalist Penny Valentine wrote,
"A truly fantastic record. Written and sung by Dave Mason, who sounded so much like Tim Hardin I nearly collapsed. It has a big tight production by Jimmy Miller. It's a long record, very, very American sounding, and probably the best thing they've ever done."
The B-side was Withering Tree, another excellent song that was also featured on the group's second album. Despite the quality of both sides, the single failed to chart on both the UK singles chart and the US Billboard Hot 100. The Easybeats were formed in Australia in 1965, where they scored several top 5 hits. The group moved to the UK in 1966 and scored a huge international hit with the song Friday on My Mind, which was the first single they ever recorded in Britain. Unfortunately, the Easybeats never managed to replicate the success of that song, but this single from September 1968 is one of the best 45s they ever issued. Good Times was an excellent upbeat rocker with a truly infectious groove and catchy chorus. The song featured Small Faces lead singer Steve Marriott helping out on backing vocals, and his powerful voice can be clearly heard during the chorus. The song also featured the late great Nicky Hopkins on piano. When broadcast by BBC Radio, the song was heard by Paul McCartney on his car radio. And according to McCartney himself, he was so impressed by the song that he rang the station immediately to request him to play it again. The song failed to chart in Britain, but it reached number 23 in Australia and number 6 in New Zealand. Good Times has been covered by several artists over the years, including INXS, Meatloaf, and Shocking Blue. September 1968 also saw the release of one of the first singles ever issued by Apple Records. This track by Jackie Lomax was written and produced by George Harrison. And it was unfortunately overshadowed by the simultaneous release of the Beatles' new single, and by the debut 45 by Mary Hopkins, which was also issued by Apple and produced by Paul McCartney. When asked about the song, George Harrison told the melody maker that the recording of the track had been inspired by the jam session feel of Jumping Jack Flash by the Stones. And Harrison lamented the fact that the single hadn't been the success he expected it to be. The song featured a truly stunning lineup of musicians consisting of George Harrison and Eric Clapton on guitar, Paul McCartney on bass, Ringo Starr on drums, and Nicky Hopkins on piano. The B-side was a Jackie Lomax composition called The Eagle Laughs at You.
The eagle laughs at you just barely walking.
The single was well promoted and it got mostly positive reviews in the press. But unfortunately, it failed to reach the charts in both Britain and in the States. The single achieved its highest chart position in Canada, where it peaked at number 28.
She's waiting to be fed. No bed to Saturday.
One of the best British singles issued in August 1968 was this 45 by The Moon. This was the group's fifth single, and oddly enough, it failed to chart despite the fact that all their previous singles had reached the top 5. The sound of the single was very reminiscent of the sort of sound that became popular later in the 70s when glam rock started taking the British charts by storm. And And not surprisingly, many critics have cited this song as the track that pioneered the glam rock sound of the 70s. Both sides were written by Roy Wood, who at that point was already established as one of the finest pop songwriters in Britain. The single got mostly positive reviews in the press. Chris Welch from The Melody Maker wrote,
While not as good as Fire Brigade, this Roy Wood composition is a good indication of the Move's return to gimmick-free music. A sort of boogie beat underpins the guitar, and the vocals have that odd wah-wah effect that is a Move trademark. I don't know many Wild Tiger women, so I cannot speak from experience, but I once went to a cocktail party with an aggressive cat girl, and if she is anything to go by, this should be a hit.
The B-side was an excellent tune that was more akin to the sort of material that their fans expected from the band, and it probably would have been a better choice as the A-side of the single.
Save the girls upstairs for later. Now you wonder if I can manage the mood.
The single didn't make the top 40, and the Move announced that they would probably disband if their subsequent single did likewise. The song that they chose for it, Blackberry Way, became a #1 hit, so the group did not disband until 1972.
Jenny Artichoke lived in a boat dressed like a queen. You should have seen that she didn't care much about anyone, but she was oh so nice to me.
One of the most criminally underrated British bands from that period was Kaleidoscope. This was the group's third single, and it featured a more accessible sound than the previous 245s, which were more psychedelic and experimental. But this is the sort of single that should have been a huge hit. Jenny Artichoke was an irresistible catchy pop number that was perfect for the charts. Record Mirror wrote,
This is really very catchy. A surprise name perhaps to see among the chart tips, but I have the utmost confidence in these imaginative boys. This is more directly commercial than their earlier material. I positively defy you to let it pass without notice, assuming the DJs play it.
The B-side was another excellent song.
Done that I will always have the time to say just how much you are.
Despite the good reviews and the quality of both sides, the single failed to chart.
You just close your eyes and you're floating. You're so hypnotized, I'm hoping you don't see me go.
Another single from September 1968 that deserved to do much better than it did was this 45 by a group called Vamp. The group featured Viv Prince on drums. Viv Prince had achieved legendary status in the mid-60s as the rebellious and hell-raising drummer of the Pretty Things. Vamp also featured Andy Clark on keyboards and vocal, Mick Hutchinson on guitar, and Pete Sears on bass. The A-side of the single was a gorgeous psychedelic track called Floating. The Melody Maker wrote,
Amazing Viv Prince plays drums with the Vamp and is being a good boy these days. At least he was in the pub the other night. We couldn't even tempt him with an embassy and half a draft double diamond. More worried about the success of the Vamp he was, and rightly so, because it would be nice to see Viv back on the pop scene proper. His drumming is well to the fore on this middle-paced, harmonica-ridden piece of funky blues and ballad.
Despite the quality of the song, the single didn't make the charts.
Listen to me, I'll sing a song to change your mind. Your ears are deaf, your mouth is dumb, your eyes are blind.
Another good single from September 1968 was this 45 by the Hollies. The single, which was recorded at Abbey Road, was the last 45 that Graham Nash recorded with the group. Shortly after the single was released, Nash traveled to America to start getting his new musical venture together. This infuriated the other members of the Hollies, who were unable to promote the single on Top of the Pops due to Graham's absence. Penny Valentine wrote,
The Hollies really are clever people. Whether they really like what they're doing I know not, but what I do know is that they are one of the very few groups around who are sure of a constant place in the chart because of the instant commercial appeal of their records. This is a very strong Tony Hazard song about the ignorance of seeing love, given a typical hard consistent Hollies treatment. It's very competent, very good and a very big hit.
The B-side was this excellent Clark-Hicks-Nash collaboration.
Win a game, lose a game. Don't feel sad when things go bad. You just do the best you can.
The single reached number 11 in Britain but failed to chart in the States.
Cherry, lemon, tangerine, he served ice cream as though it were ambrosia.
One of the highlights from August 1968 was this single by the Mindbenders. By 1968, Graham Gouldman had already written big hits for groups such as the Yardbirds, the Hollies, and Herman's Hermits. But Gouldman failed to achieve success with his own group, the Mockingbirds. The Mockingbirds broke up in 1967 and Gouldman joined the Mindbenders in 1968. Of course, the Mindbenders also featured Eric Stewart, and both Stewart and Gouldman would form 10cc later in the 70s, achieving great success and scoring several hits in the process. This single from August 1968 was written by Graham Gouldman, and it became the final single by the Mindbenders, who broke up 8 months after its release. The New Musical Express wrote,
Written by Graham Gouldman, this is a song about suburban life that's bound to have widespread appeal. It's a story in song with a touch of nostalgia in the lyric. Nevertheless, the Mindbenders are augmented by strings in this number, which jogs merrily along with a bouncy beat, and it showcases some very attractive and ear-catching harmonies from the group. It's an undemanding disc, not difficult to digest, and in view of this, a slightly stronger melody would probably have been beneficial. First-class performance stands an outside chance.
The single didn't chart.
In a temple there sleeps a man made of stone, and though he's very old.
Another good single from August 1968 was this 45 by the World of Oz. The group's previous single, a song called Mr. Muffin Man, became a big hit in several European countries but failed to chart in Britain. The New Musical Express wrote,
Quite definitely my favorite record of the week, which, if the DJs are kind to it, could provide the World of Oz with a well-deserved hit. The title character is actually a statue, and the song tells of his thoughts as he stands in perpetual lofty isolation, but it's the gorgeous, flowing lyrical quality of the material that appealed to me so much. The group's treatment is impressive, and so is Mike Vicker's musical direction, which employs strings, flutes, trumpets, and Procol-type organ to ideal effect.
Once again, the single didn't chart in Britain but became a hit in several European countries. The song has achieved cult status through its appearance on several compilations of obscure psychedelic singles from the 60s. This single by a group called Kate was another highlight from August 1968. The A-side was a moody track with a pretty unusual sound. The track featured a prominent saxophone, which was an instrument that was very often heard on jazz or soul records, but very rarely heard on psychedelic pop tracks.
Can I be your
Penny Valentine wrote,
Mutterings have been heard on the horizon about this new group. Usually when that happens, I play a single, and am terribly disappointed. But in this case, not so. I wouldn't say it was the most commercial sound in the world, but it's certainly different. One strange thing about Kate is that you tend to listen to what's going on behind them more than actually their vocals. On this record, they have a most peculiar sound, rather like the score on those films about seedy and sordid New York and empty dance halls. Most impressive.
The single went pretty much unnoticed and sank without a trace. Later in the 70s, band member Chris Gilbey joined the Australian music label Albert Productions, and signed and managed bands such as AC/DC, The Saints, and In Excess, among many others. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to 1968. See you next time.